Hello, I'm Susan Forney from Hurricane Electric. This is my first RIPE meeting ever. I've never, and my first time in any place in the Balkans and in southeastern Europe, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm also the same Susan Forney who is a member of the NANOG board, and I am the same Susan Forney who for a long period of time was working for a small software company in Redmond, of which you may have heard. So I'm here today to talk to you about something you don't think about, which is how much your peering costs you, and I've put together this little talk called Peering Economics 101. So the questions I intend to answer for you today are, why is peering never free? When is peering worth the investment? What type of peering should you do? Why do you need a peering strategy? And why should you be a good neighbor? So first, the reason why peering is never free is because fundamentally, peering is a connection between two network devices. And network devices, as we know, are not free. People are needed to maintain networks and network devices, and we definitely know people are not free. And network devices need things like electrical power and space, and power and space in places like data centers are not free. So obviously, this is going to cost you something. So now that we've established that peering actually has a cost, like anything that has a cost, it also has a value. And so we have to think about that so we can determine whether or not it's worth it. So first, think about how much your ports cost. Besides your equipment, don't forget rack space, power, support, your optics, all of those things that you need in order to have this peering connection. And don't forget how much your cross-connect is costing you at the data center and your port on the exchange. Don't forget the setup fees for those cross-connects. And while it's true that your transit providers also consume a port and a cross-connect, so in a way it's kind of quid pro quo, this is a good exercise to keep track of your costs. And if nothing else, when your manager comes around for budget time, this will be helpful because you'll know what those costs are. So what I did was I set up a little chart here that explains the difference between an ISP and an IX. And I used some costs that are somewhat common in the industry, and I rounded them to whole numbers to make it easy to see the comparisons. And so like you can see that in the ISP column, let's say I'm paying about 200 euros is about average cost on a device, garden variety, maybe not your cheaper ones, but certainly more of the well-known ones for like a 10 gig port. Then your setup fee for a cross-connect in most data centers is going to run you somewhere around double the MRC, which is, in this case, I'm putting down 500 euros. And the setup fee for the service, again, a common charge is about 250 euros. So then, if you've got a 10 gig port from your friendly neighborhood transit provider, they're probably going to have a commit for you, and that's going to be usually about 2 gigs. I put that in there at the commit level, 2,000 for megabits per second. And the commit price, since I've set it at €1 per megabit, is 2,000 euros. Then the price per megabit for bursting, I've set at €1, just to make it easy. There's no price per port for a transit provider usually. And then the cross-connect fee is going to cost me that $250 a month. Now, if I compare it to an internet exchange, my device port still is $200. The setup fee for the cross-connect is still $500. And the setup fee for the service, I've noticed on exchanges, tends to be a little bit more. So I put in $500 just to be padded a little bit. There's no commit level on exchange, of course, or commit price or price per megabit. So then price per port, a lot of them are around 500 euros, so I put that down. Some of your member organization stuff are different, but mileage may vary. And then the cross-connect, again, $250. So we've got now, think about all those costs because they're going to come up later. Now, while it is true that each of your transit providers also consumes a port and a cross-connect, this is a good exercise to keep track of your costs. And to determine if your peering port is a good investment, you also need to think about how much traffic you could actually move to that port. So to determine that, you should consider who your potential peering partners would be on an exchange. First, exchanges where you can reach content networks or cloud providers can be very advantageous, especially if those are content or cloud providers that your network uses heavily. Don't forget to peer with caching networks like Akamai, Fastly, Limelight, etc., because a lot of your traffic goes to them first, and then where the page is cached, and then goes on to the site where you're actually trying to get to. And if you peer with these guys, you can save yourself a lot of money. And then finally, NetFlow or SFlow can give you a lot of information about your highest traffic sources and destinations. And one example I can give here is I had some friends at a university who were trying to figure out what peering could do for them. And I said, well, do you know where your traffic goes? And they just give me this blank stare because they weren't using NetFlow. And as it turned out, there was a friendly salesman who wanted to sell them a service and was happy to do a monthly trial. So we set that thing up and configured NetFlow on a few ports and started to gather some statistics in a collector and figure out what's going on. And we discovered that this university, this is a large university, most of their traffic wasn't going like earlier we had that presentation about having a university network for research projects and, to be able to share information, and they did do that. But the bulk of their traffic was going to, and this is like about 4 years ago that this happened, I'm sorry. I didn't turn my phone off. This is going to Netflix. And so This was rather a surprise because we weren't thinking about the fact that they were hosting traffic for the dorms. And what do students do mostly in the dorms? They stream video services. And so we were very surprised to find 75% of the traffic on their network was going to Netflix. And as it turned out, the exchange that they were looking at, peering at, had Netflix. So in this case, for them going to an internet exchange and setting up a peer with Netflix was going to save them a surprising amount of cash. It was going to be significant. So that's the reason why you should take a look at where your traffic is going, because you can make a little bit more strategic decision about who you should be peering with. Now, once you have this information, you can start to see if getting that port on the exchange is going to make good business sense based on cost. So what I've done here is I've charted those costs that we talked about earlier. Remember, we talked about that we had a 2 gig commit, and we were paying $1 a megabit for bursting and for our commit price. So so you can see that until we get to that commit, like right there, you can see where the chart bends and starts to go straight for the blue line, which is the ISP. Right there, that's 2,000 megabits or 2 gigs. And so the price per megabit is actually on an ISP is very expensive until you get to that commit. And then it starts, flowing out to, more or less $1 a megabit. Because remember, you have to factor in that monthly cross-connect charge. So it's really about 22.50 euros per month for that, for that single ISP charge. So, but that cost is sunk until you get to 2 gigs. And then the bursting adds cost to it, but it starts to average out and gets really close to eventually €1. Now, for the IX cost, you look at it, and until it's, our total cost there was the $500 a month, remember from the last slide, for the fee, and then the $250 a month for the cross-connect. So that's $750 a month for the ISP. And when you average that out, the orange line is what you get. So then it starts to, get smaller and smaller and smaller as you get to, in this case, I stopped at 8 gigs because, most of us don't put a lot more traffic than that out there. And you can see that it doesn't quite get to free, but it gets really close. I mean, I think at 8 gigs there, it's at about 19 cents a meg. So far, so this is looking really good, right? Well, what we have to remember is that we're still going to have some traffic on the ISP. And so what I did in this graph is I showed you what the costs are if the ISP, which is the orange line, was 50% of the traffic at any given point in this graph. And what the cost looks like for the IX at 50% of any point in this graph. So like at 4 gigs, you can assume that 2 gigs of traffic is the ISP and 2 gigs of traffic is the IX. And then the blue line is the actual cost per megabyte averaged out between these two costs. So still, things are looking pretty good, right? However, this is what you really need to take into account. What actually happens is because you have that 2 gigs of sunk cost, you really aren't breaking even on that peering point if you have half of your traffic going to the ISP and half of your traffic going to the IX until you get to 4 gigs, because you have to pay for that IX traffic, whether or not you use it. So you can see that where that red line is, where the 4 gigs is, that's where that starts to converge and starts to be a little bit more reasonable. The actual cost still goes down, but you really are paying a total of our $750 per month for the IX and our €2250 for euros and 750 euros for the for your cost. Your total cost is 3,000 euros per month. And so you have to think about these things when you go to an IX. Do I have enough traffic to make it worth it to me? Is it really going to save me some money? Okay, so then after you have all the bad news about what your monthly MRCs are, then you don't forget to factor in your operational support costs, because you can save by streamlining and automating them. So you should do this as much as possible. First, one thing I would suggest is just create 2 or 3 basic peer groups for all of your neighbors that most of your cases are going to fall into. And then all you're going to need to know to turn up a peer is their AS number, their IP address, maybe their AS set, and their suggested prefix limits. And you're ready to go. And you can set those configurations up and not spend a lot of time and manpower doing that. Second, consider the support priority of your peers. This is a common mistake. It probably is not a good idea to wake up your network engineers in the middle of the night because, smallcompany.com went offline at 2:30 in the morning. It's not significant to your bursting rate. So, you probably shouldn't be spending those operation costs monitoring those type of things. If you're in the case of that university and it's Netflix that that goes offline, yeah, you probably want to wake them up. So. Or you may want to consider just waiting until the next morning, but it's probably a little more important for you, a little more compelling. So then you should monitor your port capacity on your IX connections and increase it before you get in trouble. Again, this is another common mistake. People think of the traffic as free, and they're not paying for it. Some people don't monitor it. They don't pay enough attention to it. The next thing you know, your port's saturated and you're in trouble. And that causes just as much problem on your network as if your ISP port gets saturated. And finally, I suggest using communities and local preferences to make your peering a little smarter, so that you can be a little bit more strategic with how you're announcing your routes and get a little bit more value because you're getting better performance off of that link. Now, while money is important, and we all know we can't run networks without money, that is not the only consideration for the economical value of your port. Peering can actually provide real benefits in terms of reduced latency and improved throughput. Like for the example of the university, I'm sure that the streaming was a lot better after they started peering with Netflix. And similarly, if you are, peering with a cloud provider like Amazon or Microsoft or Google or somebody like that, and you peer with them directly, and they honestly are usually willing to peer with you for exactly the same reasons you're willing to peer with them. They also want to save ISP costs. Then you're going to see some definite benefits in that performance. And you also can gain more diversity at your edge. This is going to improve traffic flow, decrease latency, and it can help you when you lose a peer or an ISP provider, because when your routers rebuild their tables, it's going to happen more quickly when one link goes down, because not so much traffic will be consolidated on that link, and therefore not that many routes have to be reconverged. This improves the scale of your network, and it prepares you for future growth. It just makes it easier for you to be bigger, and your internal and your external customers will be happier. And honestly, it's kind of like that credit card commercial where they talk about, like in this case, it would be like, how much does a peering connection cost? X number of dollars. How much is it worth when the guy in accounting who's been complaining for the last 3 weeks about his connection to Amazon being horrible, and now it's great. That's priceless. So, if it makes your internal customers happier, external customers happier because they're getting better connectivity out of your network, then, that can have value beyond any amount of money that you're paying. The easiest option, I guess now we're going to start talking about what kind of peering you might like to do. And when people start peering with an exchange, A very popular option is just to peer with the IX route server. And this is attractive for a lot of reasons. For one, you only have to set up that one peering session with the route server. You get all those routes. It's a quick and easy way to get to most of the networks on the exchange. And even if you peer individually, you still may want to peer with the route server as well, but you might want to prefer the directly connected peers over the route server. The disadvantage with this approach is you do have less control. You also don't necessarily get all of the routes on the exchange because a lot of people who peer on the exchange don't advertise all of their routes to the route server, and some networks don't peer with the route server at all. So, and then again, some exchanges don't even have route servers. But, you know, if you're just getting set up, sometimes it can be a nice way just to get on the exchange. Also, another type of peering to do on the exchange is across a direct, is outside the exchange across a direct private connection. And this really is something that usually happens only between larger networks. You create a cross connect between two networks in the same data center, and if it justifies the cost of the port and the cross connect, then it's a good deal for both networks, and they skip the port setup fee inside of the ISP. It's also something to consider if you are doing a whole lot of traffic with an individual network and it's saturating your port. Some exchanges like to keep that traffic off of the switch fabric to cut down on the overhead. So it's something to think about, something large networks do. As with the peer on the exchange, this type of peering can be paid or free. Just depending on the politics, honestly, on sometimes it's just I'll pay for the port here and you pay for the port there, but it is kind of an internal thing that two networks decide, so no real rules there. So then the last type of peering is the most obvious, of course, is peering directly with other networks on the exchange on an exchange switch. And it's a very common, convenient way to set up peering sessions because once you have that port set up, you can peer with everybody who's there, and it's just a matter of configuring the BGP session. You have more routing options when you peer individually with networks than you do with peering with the route servers. And once the port's in place, you can literally turn peers up within seconds. Peering across the exchange can be free or it can be settled. It's very uncommon for it to be settled or paid, but I mention it because it happens sometimes. But most of the time, peering across the exchange is no cost other than what it costs to get on the exchange. So now that we've talked about what it costs and what kind of people you'd like to peer with and how you'd like to set it up, I'm going to talk to you about why you need a peering strategy. And so a peering strategy is going to get you the most value from your exchange port. And some of the things to consider are what networks on that exchange would benefit you the most, what exchanges should you join, and how will you route the prefixes you receive in your network. So first, to determine if a network peer makes sense for you, look to see if you're going to send a lot of traffic to this peer over your transit connection, then this is the place where you could save money. So first obvious one. Then if a direct connection with lower latency would be a huge performance improvement on your network, then again, this is a great reason to peer with somebody. And then, do you have excess bandwidth on your IX interface? And this is really the most important question, because if you have an internet exchange point, and let's say that some really compelling peer that you do a lot of traffic with joins an exchange and you have an opportunity, if you already have a mostly full port on your IX, you might have to make some hard decisions, because adding that peer could fill your port up. So you need to think about these things when you're considering it, and you can, or you might want to get more ports on the exchange. I've seen people do things like have 2 ports on the exchange, and then 1 or 2 large peers goes across one port, the small peers goes across the other. Depending on how they want to balance the traffic, but you have some options. But it pays to think about this in advance before you have a problem. You've got bits falling all over the floor. So, to illustrate how peering on an exchange can cause problems you might not have thought of, I have developed this little drawing of a couple of networks, and to talk about why a peering strategy is important. So, the first network is, I called it AS7777. That is a network that has a satellite office in another country. and it has a connection to its satellite. The satellite office has a router connection to the main network, and it has a connection to the internet to make local traffic less painful, so it doesn't have to go all the way back to the main office and then come back to them. So it's shorter. And the other network is AS88888, and that is a network that little satellite office happens to do a lot of traffic with. And it's situated in the same country, and you can see it's got customers, and they connect across the internet. But, of course, internet connections are expensive. So, at one point, AS777 joins the Internet Exchange, and lo and behold, they find AS888 on there too. And this seems like a really good idea until they discovered that, because of the way they're advertising their routes, now exactly what they didn't want to happen with their satellite office is happening between the traffic between 888 and the satellite office. It's going all the way through that other country, over to the IX, back through and back out, creating a lot of latency. And so this is why when you go on the Internet Exchange, you need to think about how your traffic is going to be advertised and how you're going to keep the traffic local and make sure that you improve performance instead of making it worse when you go onto that exchange. So as I've demonstrated, peering can improve your routing and reduce latency or not. If you peer at more than one location, this is why you should consider a routing architecture that allows you to strategically announce your prefixes. And some peers can benefit your network more than others. And figuring out that can get you a better return on your investment. So peering works when it's a good experience for both parties, which is why you should be a good neighbor. Clean up your advertisements. It does not create confidence when someone looks at what you're advertising to them and they find a lot of private IP space and, or possibly you're leaking the entire internet to them. So please be careful about what routes you advertise. Please be easy to contact by keeping your information up to date. You can do this in PeeringDB, you can do it at RIPE, wherever you choose to do it, but it is really a good idea to be easy to get a hold of in the event of a problem, especially if some person is doing something naughty on your network and they need to get a hold of you. Keep your IRR records up to date. This is really important in today's world, and it affects traffic that goes across the internet or across the IX exchange just the way it does across the internet. While the other networks you are peering with on the exchange are probably fine and wonderful people, as I'm sure all the people in this room are, you should trust nobody. Set maximum prefix limits for your peers. And my favorite story about this is when I was working in a large telco hotel, I met a lot of other network operators, and one of them came crawling out of the network. I came in the building early one morning, and this guy was crawling out of the elevator, half dead. And I asked him what happened. He said, one of my peers advertised the internet to me last night. And I said, well, didn't you have maximum prefix limits set? He said, I do now. So don't be like this guy. Set those maximum prefix limits because honestly, accidents happen. People accidentally advertise routes they don't mean to all the time. This will save you. Filter the routes to accept only the routes that are valid from the peers' ASs and deny private IP space and bogons. Again, you should be doing this for the people that you advertise to, but you shouldn't trust that the people who that your routes you're accepting are going to do it. So you should be filtering for that. And if you are worried about filtering, actually it is easier than it's ever been. Building BGP filters for your peers is super easy. You can script it yourself, or you can use a tool like BGP Q3. I've given you an example here of where I just took a network, AS44684, which happens to be Mythic Beast, some friends of mine in the UK. And I generated a IPv6 prefix list in just that one command line for a Juniper router. And there it is. It's that simple. So it's quick and easy. You can script that with BGP Q3, no problem, and you can set those filters up very quickly. And you can actually update them every 24 hours if you want, which is a good idea. And it keeps everybody honest. You're filtering your peers. You should always filter them. So again, be responsive when you're notified of an issue. Nobody likes a peer who ignores them, especially if they're experiencing a DDoS attack, phishing, or spam, or any other sorts of naughty things that somebody on your network might do. No one can take permission of you without your no one can take advantage of you without your permission, and so control your advertisements because this prevents that from happening. And not all networks are going to want to peer with you. Usually this has more to do with their peering policy and nothing to do with you. But on the other hand, it never hurts to ask. If they say no, it didn't get any worse. So that's all I have for you today. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, Kemal from Thousand Eyes. So taking in consideration that you are thinking about the economics of the peering, I'm wondering what are your thoughts about the prices that large eyeball networks such as Comcast and AT&T are charging towards the content providers that require their peering for the latency purposes?
Are you wondering if they charge them?
No, I'm wondering what are your thoughts on the extreme prices that they are charging them?
Well, with any of those content providers or any of those large networks, what you pay them is what you can negotiate. And those, having worked for a rather large network in the past that negotiated that sort of thing, I can tell you that they negotiate really hard. And they try, they work really hard to make deals. And sometimes they get good prices, and sometimes you're the windshield, sometimes you're the bug. And sometimes you get a great price, sometimes you don't. But it all depends on what you can negotiate. And honestly, for you guys in this room, it's really not that different. At the end of the day, any price you pay for an ISP depends on what you can negotiate. It never hurts to say to an ISP, can you do a little better job? Because, you never know. It never hurts to ask. If you ask and they say no, it didn't get any worse. So, it never hurts to negotiate.
Hi, Susan. David Huberman from ICANN, speaking for myself. So you mentioned that sometimes it makes sense for two networks who wish to peer to do so over a private direct connection.
Yes.
For access networks, connecting to things like cloud networks or more classic eyeball networks like a Netflix or something, does that ever make sense?
It depends on how big of a customer you are to that provider.
Okay.
So for instance, Hurricane Electric, peers, directly with, people like that, a lot of people like that, because we can offer them a great deal of traffic, and across a private connection, it makes some sense. The other problem is that sometimes when you're trying to do that across an internet exchange, you put a lot of overhead on the switch fabric, and especially if it's a smaller exchange, they might not be as happy about you doing that. And so then, everyone's happier when you make that private connection between two peers. When I was at Microsoft, we did a lot of those kind of connections as well for exactly the same reason.
So generally speaking, you want to consider private direct connections with a peer if the circumstances where you're peering and how much traffic you may be exchanging may make more sense for everyone.
For everyone, yes. And honestly, like if you were doing, 10 gigs is not as, 10 gig is kind of the new 1 gig, and it's not as compelling as it used to be. But I think in a lot of cases, even 10 gigabits of traffic with some of these larger providers might make them, pause and say, oh, you know what, I think I could do a direct connect with you. And some of them, some of the larger providers, like the cloud providers especially, they have direct connect, ports, and they're more than happy to set you up for a fee to connect to them directly.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Susan. My name is Desiree Milosevic, and was on the RIPE SE program committee and also with a company called Affiliates. So thank you so much for this very useful presentation and good questions to ask. I wonder if you had any suggestions, for example, for the networks. For example, in Bosnia, there are about 70 internet service providers, and there's no internet exchange. That means there should be a lot of direct peering or peering happening elsewhere. Are there any studies that show maybe an example of what happened to a peering network when one of these big CDNs like Google moves in, like it was the case in Kenya, for a country without an internet exchange point? How does it reach this critical mass, and what's the strategy about building this peering network so the data becomes more and more valuable and attracts bigger data exchanges?
Well, so to kind of answer that question, you know, when you have to do direct connections to everybody to, you know, get, you know, to peer with them, it can be expensive because that, you know, you're spending that, you know, cross-connect fee and that port, you're dedicating the port and spending that cross-connect fee every month, and that can get to be a little bit expensive. And if you're the little guy, you know, then you're probably paying the cross-connect fee. And so then that, you know, and then the transit cost, you know, it's kind of hard to justify because it starts to get really expensive and it doesn't really pay that well. So to get around that, that's the reason why internet exchanges tend to spring up. And what I would tell you is that, you know, when I first started working in Seattle, the Internet Exchange, the Seattle Internet Exchange, was literally in a broom closet in the data center. I'm not kidding. It was the broom closet. There was no ventilation in there. They put, like, you know, they set it up so that they could, you know, get, you know, heat in and out. And they got a switch donated, and the building donated electricity, and they weren't even in a data center. They were in a closet on the 18th floor where the meet me rooms are, right outside the meet me rooms. That's where they were, and that's how they got started. And they got donations from, you know, large companies in the area for when they got to the point where they reached critical mass and they needed a bigger switch. Like I remember we went to a gig, you know, they needed help, and people donated switches, and you know it kept going, and then sooner or later they got enough mass to where, you know, they could start charging for their services and be self-sustaining and hire employees, and you know that's how it all starts out. But really, you know, if you're trying to get an internet exchange started, all you need is someone who is willing to, you know, host a switch for you, know, get a switch, get someone to host it, and then, you know, then the data center's happy to run the cross connects because after all, they make money off of that. So, you know, but that's how it gets started. And really, it just takes a little bit of initiative on your part. It sounds like a big deal in the beginning, but, you know, where there's a will, there's a way, and if you can get enough people together, you know, wherever, they always say that, you know, an exchange is where 3 or more networks meet. So, you know, if you can get to start with that first 3 networks, then you can make the party a little bit bigger.
Thank you. So that's a piece of a puzzle on the answer of starting a little closet somewhere. Thank you.
You never know where you're going to find a broom closet.
Hi, it's Fergus Mackay speaking as myself. If anybody is thinking of starting an exchange and people offer them switches, if they offer you a nice big old switch, do the math on the power. Okay? You want a new switch, a low power switch, because these old big hunking great switches, they may look great on your resume to say you have one, but the power bill kind of breaks your economics very early on. And that's certainly a big issue in Africa, and it's probably not as big an issue here, but it's still money that's going out the door. Get a nice Arista or a TP-Link, something cheap.
Yeah, and full disclosure, Fergus Mackay is my husband.
Well,
But the other thing is that, you know, don't be shy about pointing out to the viability to a data center of all of the cross connects they're going to generate and why they should give you a space to put your switch and give you free power.